And today we have Carlos again from West Ed, and we're very excited for our final study session with him. So he will present the PowerPoint presentations that you have in front of you. So, Carlos?
Thank you and good morning. Thank you again for having me back. Based on our last conversation, I wanted to do something a little differently in response to just kind of understanding and talking more specifically around the role that state boards play. We're still from the standpoint of the four domains. We'll speak between amongst those policies that many states are using to drive change across those four areas. I want to make sure that I pause for both members who are on the phone as well. I'm not sure if we will have the PowerPoint on the screen or not, or we're just following along. I'll pause just for a second. Okay. Oh. There we go. Thank you very much. So today, just taking a step back, and I think we kind of started here with some conversation, but I thought it was important to kind of have a pause and say, first of all, have a discussion of what is turnaround. And we'll then spend the remainder of the time really talking through how state boards, state legislators, and states are using this accountability and support as drivers for the change. We will specifically start looking at some of those state board actions, some of those policies that have been put in place. Again, we will do this through the lens of the four domains. The four domains represents what we have learned in terms of research and the role that systems play, moving beyond just the past practice of this is a school challenge and schools must figure this out. This has really helped to give some framing to the role that systems play, meaning schools, districts, and states themselves. Again, I'll make sure to pause. So just a quick reminder, the four domain areas looks at turnaround leadership, talent development, instructional transformation, and culture shift. We did a really deep dive last meeting into turnaround leadership. We actually had a conversation around one of the growing discussions of what's different between a turnaround leader and an effective leader in any other environment. And I have to tell you, this is one of the more eye-opening national discussions we have. I was just sharing with Devin last week. I was in a meeting last week, and that was the answer, is the principles. And that we're going to have this new slant around some of the policies, the accountability policies. We're also going to still touch on the turnaround leadership domain as well. So what is school turnaround? Here's how we define it at the Center on School Turnaround. It is defined as quick, dramatic, and sustained, meaning that it's quick, that it produces significant changes in operating environment. Sometimes when people hear the word quick, there's an assumption that you're going to improve very quickly. What research tells us about turnaround is that sometimes when you go in and change the operating environment, there's going to be dips in achievement because you are changing the way people think, believe, and act. And that impacts practice as well. But it's dramatic. It produces significant gains over a short period of time. Again, the goal of turnaround isn't that we have 10 years. The ship is moving in the wrong direction, and we have to turn the ship around. It's a trajectory. It's sustained. It creates a learning organization prepared for long-term success. Not just that we're getting off of a list, not just that we're moving from the bottom 5% to the bottom 8%, but we're trying to develop an infrastructure that allows for a long-term sustainability in a different way of what I like to call the way we do business as an organization and as a system. It's a disruption. It's a disruption of belief, practices, and behaviors across a school and school district. And I'll add that to a state. It's a commitment to rethink and redesign systems, including the district. I should underline this commitment because a lot of people like to say they're doing turnaround. You cannot do turnaround without the commitment of the organizations to do it. Because change is going to happen, and anytime that change happens, people are going to be upset. They're going to be upset because there's a disruption of what their norm has been. It's the chance to recreate a new norm. And everyone is not going to be on board of recreating the new norm. So I wanted to kind of just start there, and just kind of reground us in these conversations around turnaround, particularly through the lens of the 4 domains. I'm going to pause and just see if anyone had any reflections, thoughts on just the definition of how we define school turnaround. Okay. Anyone on the phone? Board members on the phone?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Sounds good. So with that definition, and I shared this screen the previous 2 times I was here because it's critically important. This is the question we have to ask ourselves. Are we designed for turnaround? Because every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. So if we have a system that's in place that doesn't allow for a disruption of practices, beliefs, behaviors, then we will get the results that don't lead to turnaround. And this is one that I share with you. If you do not remember anything else over the past 3 trips that I've been here, this is a question we have to consistently and constantly ask ourselves. Are we designed to get the system that we want to see? Role of the state board. I talked about this in our first meeting and our second meeting, what we're seeing across the country and thinking about accountability. Accountability has to be a reciprocal process. And here's a statement to think about. For every increment of performance I demand from you, I have an equal responsibility to provide you with the capacity to meet those expectations. And that's what I say I see the difference in across the policy context of turnaround. There's a lot of states that will take a heavier hand on the accountability side, while also having a smaller pot in the support side. So today, majority of our conversation is going to be highlighting some of those accountability opportunities to drive change from your role. But I didn't want to just leave here without having a chance to talk about how many states are also using the support hand. Because if we believe in this principle of reciprocity, I know, reciprocity of accountability, we have to think about what support looks like as well. That was a tongue twister. So this idea that accountability equals support, with the idea that we're all driving toward school change. And I have to say, if in many instances, if schools and districts could change on their own, they would. Sometimes and oftentimes they need that accountability piece that drives and forces the change, that forces rethinking, that forces a change in beliefs, behaviors, and practices as well. However, in order to really get there, the support is needed as well. Principle of reciprocity. So through the lens of the 4 domains, and I'll pause. I promise that's not my theme music.
I thought you were going to break into a slow jam.
Well, we were talking about the 70s and the mustache, so I just had kind of some music. But if someone does, feel free to jump in if someone on the phone does have questions as well. So through the lens of the 4 domains, what are we seeing from a policy standpoint? First and foremost, U.S. state boards and any state board, the 48 state boards across the country or other legislators, have the opportunity to require reporting. So where do you stand? What is the number of principals with less than 2 years leading your low-performing schools? What are those data points that you want to identify that helps you understand what success looked like? What are the 2 to 3 outcomes you want to identify as a reporting to give you an idea on how far schools and districts are going towards seeing positive impacts around turnaround? What evidence or indicators are signaling those outcomes, and what approaches are being used to lead the change? You always have the reporting mechanism, and across states, there are many states who are asking their respective districts and schools to not only report, but continually report, and are identifying what we call these implementation indicators as a part of that. So implementation, yes. Corey?
Do we know the right data to be asking for?
It's a great question. So it looks different across the country, but there are a set of indicators that you can look at, and we're going to talk a little bit about those. Some of those indicators that helps tells a story is teacher attendance, for example. So a lot of people are waiting for the end achievement, and that's certainly one piece of it. But if you're going from a teacher attendance rate that increased over the course of the past year, that tells a story. Student attendance over the past year increased, that tells a story. If it decreases, it tells a story as well. So some of those types of indicators, which we'll talk about, begin to tell a story of success. Because I like to say, if you're seeing over the course of 3 years, achievement data increasing, but you're also seeing teachers who are staying in the school. You don't see as high a turnover rate. You're seeing principals who are staying in the school. You don't see as much of a turnover rate. You're seeing teacher attendance increase. You're seeing student attendance increase. Those are indicators that something is working well there when you add that with the achievement data. So those are all indicators that tells a story. If you begin to see the decreases, it obviously signals a story as well. That will maybe cause some pause to what are we not doing that is causing more students to not come, more teachers to not attend, higher number of principals who are leaving the school as well. Does that make sense? Anyone on the phone have questions to Board Member Corr's question? Okay.
No.
Okay. So going back to these implementation indicators and behavior indicators, and when you're developing, and there's a wide range, some of the things I just talked about, student attendance, teacher attendance, turnover rate in school systems, thinking about what's the plain language we want to put forward in terms of reporting, thinking about those different elements that play a role in telling the success or lack thereof. Some of those leading indicators here, we highlight discipline referrals, obviously those formative assessment, some of those lagging indicators, and your summative assessments, graduation rates, post-secondary, job success. All of those things are kind of post-performance. But if you're thinking about those leading indicators over the course of 3 years, let's say they're on a list for 3 years, and 3 years they're expected to exit priority. You don't have to wait to the end of the third year to see some of these leading indicators. Teacher attendance, student attendance, discipline referrals, formative assessments, those things that help tell a story. The lagging indicators are going to be kind of post. At that stage, it's almost too late if that's the only data points you're looking at. Because at that point, 3 years have passed, and you could say that turnaround, if they're giving 3 years, and I don't know what they're giving here in Arizona. Some states is 3 years, some states get 4 years, some get 5, in terms of the expectation to exit turnaround status. But if you're looking at post-performance data at 4 or 5 years, that's 4 or 5 years gone. And that's where we get into this question of, did it fail or not? When we should have been, throughout the process, looking at this data to learn what's working. It requires and forces the districts to then have a learning environment as well, because they're looking at this leading indicator data as well. And there's a story that's being told. You should expect the first year that there are probably going to be dips. The first year of any change effort, you're probably going to see dips in teacher attendance, for example. But in year 2, if it's still going down, then there's something wrong with the strategy or the intervention and the implementation. I'll pause for questions. Okay. So you have obviously the power to look at reporting data. And what I've seen across the country is the reporting data provides a driver for school districts to be involved. One of the challenges we see is that turnaround and school improvement has been seen as a school challenge only. You hire a principal, and he or she is hired to go do their magic. When you start having these accountability policies where districts are now reporting on the data, it forces the engagement of the districts. There are some states who make these public reporting, they make it public. It's live streamed on television because it adds a different level of accountability to the district staff, because it's not the principal who's standing there presenting by himself or herself. It's actually the district representatives. So that forces them to be involved. So some accountability policies. Again, just real quick highlight of what is turnaround leadership. It's meant to highlight that turnaround leaders at all levels drive initiatives at all levels. They make turnaround a priority, and turnaround leaders catalyze and organize this turnaround work. And that's at the school, the district, and state level. So that's the domain in itself. I added here what some states are doing to support turnaround leadership. A state can appoint a turnaround partner or a technical assistance partner. The state board can employ several interventions when a school's received some acceptable rating, whether that be an F or D, or sometimes some states call them warning schools before they even get to kind of the F status or turnaround status. So in Georgia, for example, they appoint a school improvement team that will recommend actions, including individual administrators and teachers. In Virginia, a turnaround school, the district has to hire a turnaround provider. They're required to have a turnaround provider. The turnaround provider is vetted at the state level. The turnaround provider is working with the district to support the school, because their theory of action is that the entree into this change work is at the system level and at the district level. The district could, at the end of the year, assess whether it was a good match in terms of that turnaround provider. And I have seen in Virginia turnaround providers being replaced because it wasn't a good match. But that was a state board policy that said essentially what I started out saying: if schools could do this work, they would have done this work. They need support and help, and we're going to find the best experts out in the country to make them available to support and help the districts as well. I'm going to pause and see if you have any questions on this particular policy issue.
Who are those people? They're principals? Who are they?
So they're companies like mine. We do hire a lot of principals and former principals as well. They are working in schools across the country. So one instance, American Institutes of Research is working with one of the schools in Virginia, which is a sister company of West Ed. They're working at the district level. So you can create a vetting process for how you get on a list to become a turnaround provider. And oftentimes what a state says is they have to have the expertise. And companies like myself or other companies have to prove they have the expertise that are going to be working on this project. There are other accountability measures that they have to meet as well: a history of working with schools, a history of success. So there's a lot of turnaround providers, but West Ed, AIR, many others that exist.
Has there been like a collection of the reports and research that will come out of all these visits and support? I imagine they would be great lessons or white papers.
Yeah, they are. So Virginia is one of the places that requires their districts to report to the state board. And under the previous state superintendent, this was actually on local television. And the turnaround providers were actually there as part of the presentation as well. I think there's been a shift, so they don't televise it now. But there are reports that they have to submit. Our neighbors, Nevada, has something very similar where they created a providers list, and the schools they vetted the providers list. The schools have to select and identify a support team from the providers list. There's a report that then comes about. There's an evaluation of the entire process, which I would always recommend. Anytime you take on turnaround work, you should be also conducting an evaluation to learn what's working as well, particularly from the policy standpoint.
So can you share with us some of those, I mean, now or later, a report? I want to see what's working. I want to see the details and how you exit and how you keep these schools and teachers and leaders empowered.
Absolutely.
Because we talked before about you can kind of go in and it works for a while and then the leader goes out and that's not really an effective use of our resources.
Absolutely.
But I would like to see some examples. Ideally, in states that are demographically similar to Arizona.
Yeah, we can do a deep dive into Virginia for sure. Nevada's in the early stages. They're in now year 2, but there are certainly some lessons learned. So, for example, Nevada right now is one of the states that have created kind of the evidence-based intervention provision. They've actually created a list of individuals who have met and have provided evidence that they've met one of those 3 tiers that is listed in an evidence-based intervention. So those are the only entities that can work with those schools. And it's one of the more stringent accountability systems in the country as it relates to the evidence-based requirement. I cannot think of another state that has a more stringent evidence-based intervention and support mechanism in place. And I think they would say that there's been some early lessons learned, and we can have a deep dive into that as well as create an opportunity for you all to talk with them as well.
I would really appreciate that. Thank
Absolutely. Any board members on the phone have questions?
Not at this time. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Carlos, I have a question.
Yes.
I think it was back in like 2016 or 2017, Georgia was moving towards a state turnaround officer. Did they get away from that, or do they still have that?
No, they don't have it now with the new governor. Several years ago around that time, Georgia put on the ballot, and this had to go out for public vote, to create an opportunity district, which was a state-run district similar to the Recovery District in Louisiana and Tennessee's Achievement District. It was pretty much, from what everyone thought, was a done deal. The governor argued that we attract businesses because we create school systems that develop those individuals that are going to work in those businesses. And toward the end, you saw a groundswell at the local level that was against the Opportunity District. So it did not pass. However, although that failed, the state board did create and hire a chief turnaround officer. We've partnered with them and done a lot of work with them over that past year while he was in place as a turnaround officer. This individual had an office that reported directly to the state board. This individual also worked with those schools that were on the list. There were 2 different lists. There was kind of the ESSA list, and then there was a previous list for which this Opportunity District was brought forward. So he partnered with the SEA staff as well to support school turnaround across the state. This past year, you had a new governor that came in. He did not want to continue to keep that particular role, so that role was then folded into the Georgia Department of Education. The work continues, but through the Georgia Department of Education, without the supervision of the state board. Thanks for asking that question, because that's a great model and great discussion of how they started out with an opportunity district focus, meaning that the state would run a district, many of the schools, and they highlighted the criteria that would be used to identify which schools will be part of the opportunity district. Unfortunately, they had to go to public to vote for it, and they voted against it.
I have a question. In your work with various states, do you find the similar patterns in terms of across title schools, for example, across small rural schools, for example, large public high schools, inner city schools, and so in a sense, it doesn't really matter which state the examples come from.
No.
It's more of the characteristics of the context.
Well said.
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Context matters all the time, without a doubt, in terms of the work itself. But you're right. We're seeing the same challenges.
Okay.
I was brought into Montana, and the first thing Montana said to me is, "Carlos, you don't understand." They had everyone in, school educators. You don't understand. We can't find turnaround leaders. The week before I was in Baltimore City, and that's the first thing Baltimore City said as well. So it's the same issues, The context looks different. There are definitely challenges to finding people to lead schools when all your low performing schools are on reservations in Montana. But there are, as Devin, there's a challenge in finding turnaround leaders, how we define turnaround leaders in any school here in Arizona as well, because that's one of the major problems we see. First and foremost, there's not enough of them. And then when you do get them, they don't like to stay past the turnaround concept of it. They enjoy the messiness, and so they're ready to move on to the next one. Or they get hired by the state, or they get hired by the district, or they become a superintendent, et cetera. So there's just not enough of them. So that's one of the big issues. And when you marry that with what the research says has the most impact on what happens in the classroom, first and foremost is who's leading your class, the teacher, and second is the principal. So similar challenges. The context looks different, to your point. Absolutely. Absolutely. Hence the Virginia work. Virginia has a mixture of some urban schools and rural schools when you go to Southern Virginia that now have providers, where before those rural schools didn't have access to some of these companies that we're talking about. Because it wasn't cost effective, to A, the rural schools didn't have as much money. B, it wasn't cost effective from a company standpoint to the amount of money it takes to get to those rural and remote areas as well. And so this particular policy allowed those individual school systems where the principal may also be the superintendent, maybe even the bus driver in some instances, to now have actual support and help and thought partnership to drive the work as well.
Carlos, so for Georgia and Virginia, for example, if a school or an LEA were selecting a turnaround provider in Virginia's case or appointed an improvement team, if they continue to not be successful, does Georgia or Virginia have additional interventions or steps that they take after that, or have they not gotten?
They haven't gotten there yet.
Okay.
But they do have in legislation additional steps that they can take. In both of these cases, the interesting part, so I'll just use Georgia, much of the work, to Alicia's question around kind of this opportunity district, much of the work was actually identified in high schools and in the rural communities. The Atlanta Metro, which has Cobb County, Atlanta, Fulton County, DeKalb, I mean, there are a number of entities knocking on the door to support them. But when you go to rural Georgia, they don't have access. You go to Bibb County, which is in Macon, they don't have access. So much of the work that came from this opportunity district that led to this chief turnaround officer was actually in the rural areas and at the secondary level, because 2/3 of their schools were actually secondary schools. And I have to say, and I said this before, nationally, we have not figured out the high school turnaround component, just nationally, for a variety of reasons. A freshman coming in reading at 3rd or 4th grade level, this is part of the reason that it's a systems challenge. That it's not just the challenge at the high school level. Individual coming in reading 3 or 4 grades behind, the system failed that student as well throughout as well. And so we have not figured out completely. This is one of the more significant challenges, particularly given the policy has shifted now. If you look at Title I historically, school improvement historically was at the elementary level. With SIG and the waivers and now ESSA, you can identify high schools or secondary schools. So you're seeing more states identify high schools and secondary schools because of the graduation rate as well. Any other questions on the turnaround partner or technical assistance provider? Okay. This is a big carrot, I can say, that is happening across states. Particularly looking at the leadership component, just because there's just not enough leaders and leadership on turnaround, bringing in providers. Now, typically, I wouldn't include all this writing, but this is going to be used as a handout. So I just wanted you all to have this to be able to go back and look it up for yourselves if you want additional information. 39 states have policies related to interventions in the entity that governs or operates chronically low-performing schools, meaning that they have the ability to convert that low-performing school to a charter or hiring an outside entity to run that school. And again, that looks different across the country as well. In some cases, converting it to a charter creates its own district. If you're in Pennsylvania, that's exactly what happens. One example is the Recovery District, as I mentioned, in Louisiana, which is probably the longest standing state that has kind of had this state-run district. Their low-performing schools are identified and they become part of the Recovery District. Now, for a decade, a little less, the focus was on New Orleans schools. There were a lot of New Orleans schools that were not only becoming charters or being run by charters, but they were also becoming part of the Recovery District. You're now seeing over the past few years more of those rural parishes now having schools that become part of the Recovery District as well. This is kind of the model that people begin to look at when they begin to have a discussion around state-run districts. Tennessee kind of reviewed this model. South Carolina reviewed it when they had this conversation as well. Georgia reviewed it when they had this conversation. Nevada reviewed it and actually is running a version of state-run district as well. Another example is Illinois, where the state board may authorize the state superintendent to direct removal of any board member in which their school remains in this academic warning status as well. So those are another kind of policy accountability tool that you're seeing state boards use to drive the systems change as well. I'm going to pause and see if you all had any questions or reactions at all to this particular example.
So I have a question about Illinois, and I know that their setup is different, but it's my understanding Chicago public schools have actually seen some improvements. And I was wondering if you can talk about that, and if I know they're set up differently,
Yeah.
but if there are some lessons that we can take from that.
Yeah, Chicago has seen a lot of improvement. Part of the challenge in Chicago is the gap, where you've seen there's so many low-performing schools. ISB, Illinois, would actually have to maneuver their data to ensure that all the schools on the list aren't just from Chicago. Mm-hmm. You know, they want to make sure that they have a chance for Cairo, Illinois, to have schools on the list, and Mound City, and East St. Louis, et cetera. The challenge in Chicago is the number of schools that could show up on a list, because there are a lot of them that could. B, you have still the haves and have-nots amongst that group. You have a school district that has really developed an infrastructure for understanding what's happening in their schools. They were one of the first school systems to create kind of a turnaround office that can pull data, any data points, et cetera. They pushed the unions on being able to move out teachers to bring in the most qualified teachers, which is a really big deal. They've done this for years, and so they have some success in some of those schools. But because of the sheer numbers of schools, they still have some schools that still struggle because of some of these same challenges. You still have the revolving door in some of those schools in terms of principals and teachers, et cetera. You have the lawsuit from the teachers union around maneuvering some of the schools. But in terms of creating here's what I would say that we can learn from. They created a pro-turnaround environment from a policy standpoint, from a practice standpoint, from a leadership standpoint, which goes a long way for a system as large as Chicago, for which they've been able to move, I would say, half their schools. Think about the largeness of them. They've been able to move and have some sustainability because they created a pro-turnaround environment. So they fought the unions on the lawsuit. They fought back the bad press from the Chicago Times about teachers losing jobs. You had leadership who really stood in front to say, this isn't about the adults, this is about the kids. And that's been their mantra for now almost 10 years in creating that pro-turnaround environment. Still fighting the change that needs to happen. Still thinking about how we continue to scale up. But they've made a lot of inroads into this work from a turnaround perspective.
Great, thank you.
Absolutely. Any other questions from board members on the phone? Okay.
Not at this time. Thank you.
Absolutely. So talent development, again, defining what talent development. We believe in order for system change to occur, requires competent and committed staff at every personnel at every level, state, district, and school. Requires setting policies, procedures to identify, select, and retain and sustain these individuals. At all levels, educators utilize their instructional and transformational leadership to drive the change. Similar to your question around Chicago, this is where they really developed the infrastructure, creating a pipeline of individuals working in the school and rethinking the way they talked about schools that have been identified as low performing. Policies to address, if I go back here, 47 states have created policies related to interventions in staffing and low performing schools. This is a big entree into this work. One of the common approaches, we talked a little bit about this, was the creation of partners, creating providers lists. There are some states that are requiring that most or all staff be replaced. That's about half the states. If there's a chronically low performing school, that it allows the flexibility. And sometimes in those states, and I used to hear this all the time from the SIG work, what it creates is it creates kind of the backdrop to allow those types of changes. It's hard for a superintendent to go say this is what we're doing, but one of the things it allows in these instances is the state is saying this is what we have to do, and it creates the leverage for the superintendents to make those types of decisions, so that they can then not be quote unquote the bad guy, but they can leverage those policies for the change that happens as well. So it's about half the states in the country that are utilizing this particular policy to help think about talent development in their low-performing schools. And again, what the research tells us is low-performing schools, or those that have been identified, have higher turnover rates, higher percentages of teachers with novice teachers, higher percentages of novice principals leading those schools. What these policies have allowed those states to do in those instances is to really turn that upside down and use it as a way to leverage to bring in more highly skilled and competent staff in the most challenged schools as well. Going to pause. Any questions or reactions?
Carlos, I was just wondering, when we're looking at those 47 states that have policies in regard to staffing, or for those half of those 47 states that state incentive for them to go into those schools, like bonus pay or stipends?
Yeah.
And if so, like, if you know, like numbers.
Yes to both. And when we talk about support, that's going to be one of the areas that I highlight is the financial incentives for individuals to go into those schools. So it is a mixture of, financial incentives for folks to go into those schools, but it's also a mixture of hiring these types of lists and developing these types of lists as well. Keeping in mind that, I work for a large district. We had more capacity than probably our state Department of Education. We had access to a lot of providers. But when you look at the schools that are on a list across the spectrum, they don't. So the fact that many states are taking it upon themselves to vet some of these providers and create the list helps do some of the work for some of the more rural areas for which many of these schools are located on. So that is part of it as well.
I have a question.
Absolutely.
Carlos, you're talking about talent development at the district or school level. What have you seen in terms of helping local boards come up to speed about what's possible in terms of the turnaround. So last meeting we were talking a lot about how difficult it is to change the mindset of folks that have been in chronically underperforming districts. And you've underscored the importance that everybody has to be valued, the board, the state, the local board members.
Absolutely. Wonderful question. I could probably line up 20 states and 25 districts right now that will tell you that one of the barriers to systemic change is their local boards. In fact, a couple of years ago, I went to meet with the National School Board Association Executive Director, and I thought I was going to have to give him this spiel. And as soon as I walked in, he says, "Carlos, I'm so glad to see you because this is the number one issue for school boards, the school turnaround." So I say that to say that a lot of it is professional development and some coalescing around what is turnaround, what will it entail, what is the type of decisions that are made. What I see happens is oftentimes boards are being brought in when people in the community are complaining. So I call it a two-part. How do we work with school boards to understand what turnaround and what change is and the role that they play? But also, how do we work with superintendents to leverage school boards? Because I also sit with a lot of superintendents who say to me, I would rather apologize later for something that I've done versus bring them in the front end because of the amount of time it takes on the front end for the change to occur. I understand that point as well. So I think it is two parts. I think we can think about professional development through some of the school board associations and state-run associations, but I also think we can think about, and we talked about this at our last meeting, leadership training, not for just principals, but also superintendents as well and their teams. How do you engage boards in this? Because there is a skill. There are people who have done it and done it well, and there are people who don't do it up front. And then later on, because they didn't do it, the calls are coming in, and now they're reacting to those changes as well. So I've seen it both ways, but in my experience, it's two parts. It's helping boards understand their role in turnaround, and I've spoken at some of those National School Board Association meetings, but I also think it is working with superintendents as well to help them understand how do you leverage school boards for this type of change. Because there's a readiness level with your board members as well, given that they're going to receive the calls from the teachers, they're going to receive the calls from the parents, they're going to read the things in the newspaper as well. And that's critically important. So I do think it's two parts. New Mexico, for example, was doing with their state education office, they made it a priority to bring in the school boards into this work. Missouri did the same thing. So when they were bringing together districts, staff, and school staff, they were also bringing in presidents of school boards as a part of it. And they were making the funding available for that type of training as well.
So has New Mexico seen progress?
They have. And so New Mexico is one of the places, similar to what I've talked about here with Elevate, that not only has success through their Principals Pursuing Excellence program, where they were really focused and honed in on supporting leadership in their low-performing schools. They evaluated that and saw significant increases in achievement over the course of that as well. It was so successful, their legislators then supported teachers pursuing excellence. So they began to target their teachers who are working in low-performing schools as well. They had mentors, et cetera. But all a part of this also was inclusive was superintendent as part of the teams, as well as school board members being part of the team. And they partnered with the School Boards Association, state association, to provide professional development as well. And I've seen variations of that as well across the country.
But they are moving out of improvement. They're actually seeing.
They're seeing schools move
Yeah.
out of improvement. And they're seeing some schools stay out of improvement. Because I think I can look across the country and you can see some schools move.
Right.
But I like to call it, I won't use that term since this is on YouTube. But you do see kind of this dance where people exit and 3 years later they're back.
Yeah.
This school's exit, 3 years later they're back. And we've seen that under NCLB for a lot of times. We certainly saw it under SIG. We saw it under the waiver. We're seeing it under ESSA. We will see it under ESSA, I'm predicting as well, where many schools will exit because there's a fine line between the bottom 5% and the bottom 12%.
Right.
I mean, you change a data point and you got a different group of schools that will be in the bottom 5 and that won't be in. Similar to the example I gave in Chicago, you change a few metrics for how you're developing the lowest performing schools, and you can end up with a lot of Chicago schools. And you can shift it and change just a few, look at 3 years of data versus 4 or 5 years, and now you have a mixture of schools. So there's a very fine line.
That was my question. That's assuming that we are measuring schools in the same way, and that's assuming that they've kept the same measurement and haven't changed their metrics over time.
Absolutely.
You know, so it's assumptions there too.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah. Well, that's why those indicators are very important. And how you all as a board and as a state define turnaround success. I mentioned at our last meeting, nationally, we don't have a great definition. I know in every ESSA plan, there's an exit criteria that was developed. And typically, and I won't speak for Arizona because I don't have it in front of me, typically what we see in the exit criteria is what is going to be used to get off the list. So 3 years of progress at X percentage, and they're off the list. But what we like to say about turnaround is turnaround a trajectory. Getting off the list is just a part of it. Sustaining that progress to where you're continuing to increase, that's the actual turnaround. So turnaround is more than just that initial bolt. That initial bolt gets you off the list. Now you have to start there first, considering where many schools are starting. You first have to turn the ship and get them off the list, and you celebrate that, but there's still more work to be done. Any other questions on the phone as well? It's a great question about the school boards.
No.
Not for me.
Okay. The school boards is a really great question, particularly now where we're kind of going back to, under ESSA, kind of this local control. School boards play a major role. They're the major K-12 policymaking institution in any local district, and so they are critically important. Other talent development strategies, I just create a list here. Some states have input on hiring and termination of staff. We talked about replacement of most of all. Some states can require collective bargaining, changes to collective bargaining agreements, which is a pretty big deal. Some states could appoint an outside evaluator of the educators in those low-performing schools. Some states can require improvement plans for teachers. Some states are requiring teachers to take knowledge tests, requiring that most or all staff be replaced. And that, again, is happening in about half the states itself. So you're seeing various kind of policies that are developed to kind of drive this. This is one of the bigger challenges in school turnaround is having the people to lead, the people that work in these schools. When I say lead, not just at the school level, but at the district level as well. So this is a critical area of these two domains.
Carlos, can I ask you a question about this?
Yes, please.
So in this last slide, you kind of indicated what I would call kind of a strong state infiltration where state would get involved in hiring or terminating staff or intervening in collective bargaining agreements. That's a heavy hand.
It is.
I'm not in a strong local control type of state. My inclination is to think that any of these kinds of strategies would be very difficult to succeed in.
Yeah.
Have you seen any heavy-handed approaches like this work in a strong local control state, or is there other strategies that seem to be more effective?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I'm not advocating for any of them. I should have started there. It is a very heavy hand. I have seen, so for example, the collective bargaining agreement. I have seen where that has worked to drive the poor practices of hiring and human capital. Because without it, I would say, and if I had a couple of the districts beside me, they would say, historically, we've always hired this way, and we couldn't change our hiring practices to think differently without the state being an actor to provide us the cover. Because that's really what the state was doing. The state was listening to its superintendents about this particular issue, and they provided the cover at the local level for this change to occur. And I was just with one of the districts 6 months ago, and they presented, and they said that was the impetus for their turnaround, shift, and change 2 years ago. Again, for most of the states that are doing this, it's about cover. It's about what they're hearing at the local level from educators who are doing this work, and the request is, I need the cover to do it. If I don't have the cover, I can't do it. I'm going one way or the other as a superintendent. And so where I've seen this heavy-handed approach, it was coinciding with the requests of leaders in these particular school systems to say, I need cover. I need cover. Massachusetts is one of the states that the state superintendent would sit down with the local superintendents, and this notion of cover, once they got past once people kind of accepted the accountability pieces, because they had some very strong accountability pieces, and that former superintendent would tell you when they first released them, the governor got calls from everyone, the legislators got calls from everyone, but he had the political support to say, we're going to stay with you. The former commissioner in New Mexico would say the same thing about principals pursuing excellence. There was a lot of people against that at first. But once people saw that it started to work, then all of a sudden, those school systems in Massachusetts, as well as in New Mexico, began to request some of these types of things for cover. Now, that's not anything that people go out in public can say, but that's where I saw states use this. So I think you're right. It is heavy-handed, and that's a conversation for you as a state board to have with your educators across the state. What's the role that you could play in providing cover to make some of these hard decisions to help change the system? Does that help?
That's awesome. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this is Cal. Member Baker. I am well aware of the fact that in many Midwest, Eastern states, cover is critical because there are very strong collective bargaining agreements in effect. And the fundamental reality is that a turnaround principal or a turnaround company, if they cannot have control over personnel, they're doomed before they even start.
Yeah.
But it's just so critical to have control over hiring and transferring and terminating. But and I'm ready to be corrected on this. It's my impression that that's not really a significant issue with low-performing schools, most of the low-performing schools in Arizona.
Yeah, Board Member Baker, we're looking around. I agree with your comment. I can't speak to Arizona. I think it's a question to raise and a conversation to have. Alicia, did you want?
Member Baker, it's Alicia. So I'm not sure about the collective bargaining aspect of your comment. However, as board staff has conversations with superintendents in regard to school improvement, one of the talking points that has been risen with superintendents is how the state board can provide protection to the superintendents from the local governing boards. Just because some of the superintendents felt as if, they want to do these, these changes and do these extreme turnarounds or extreme changes, but ultimately they're afraid that, this extreme change, or if we see the dip within the first year of a school turnaround, then they ultimately would get fired or terminated from their position by the governing board.
Yes, I would suggest that. I mean, I understand that, and there's probably a role for that. But ultimately, if the local community does not have the will or the desire for improvement, it's almost impossible, if not impossible, to inflict success on that school system, because the local community, especially if it's a rural community, will find ways to reestablish their own culture over a culture that's imposed on them by someone else. So one of the things that we haven't been talking about this morning is how critically important it is to engage not just the local board, but the local community.
Yes.
And garner support for changing the culture of the system and doing better things for their children than what is currently being provided.
Yeah. I agree 100%. It's the difference between people coalescing around turnaround and people feeling like turnaround's been done to them. And in those cases where people are experiencing turnaround being done to them, it's almost impossible to be successful in those environments. I agree 100%, Board Member Baker. And part of it, and we didn't do a deep dive into culture shift, but that particular domain is really talking about that. The role that communities play, families, students in this turnaround work. And when I'm sitting with superintendents, to Board Members Baker's point around this question around the boards, the engagement piece becomes so critical because that plays such a role in your not only how successful you're going to be, but how you're going to be able to sustain this. When people are feeling like there's some ownership that we have in this, and it's critically important. I agree 100%. So moving real quickly then, still on talent development, state can require replacement of most of all staff. There's an example I have for you all here in New Jersey where the state can also reassign the teaching staff as relates to low performing schools. The state can appoint staff to conduct educated evaluations. I talked about that require improvement plans for teachers and require teachers to take knowledge tests. There's an example that I added here in North Carolina where an assistance team conducts these evaluations of school personnel in their lowest performing schools as well. In both of these cases, you have kind of the urban lens of this work, but you also have the rural lens. And in the North Carolina case, the rural and remote. Because a lot of the work that the state is doing in North Carolina is around the rural and remote area in terms of going in and working with staff as well. So just a couple examples. Again, I typically don't add all this text, but this is just a handout that you guys can use. Transitioning to kind of the instructional transformation. Again, just a quick reminder, in order for sustainable, systemic school turnaround to occur, it requires system-wide support for change in classroom instruction. Effective instructional practices must be identified and supported, and schools must cultivate an environment of both high expectations and support. What I like to call this instructional infrastructure. I'm always shocked at how often I spend time with schools and school systems and there's not an instructional infrastructure in place. No matter how much I've seen this, I still get shocked that this is not in place.
So this comes back, this is another interesting question. So we as a state board set standards, but we do not dictate course sequence. We don't dictate. I mean, not even curriculum. I mean,
Yes.
I'm talking about like
Yes.
how the standards are taught and in what order. And so like we don't know. I mean, that makes data collection really difficult.
Absolutely.
And like, so I just wonder about that as compared with like a situation like New York City, for example, where they have Regents exams
Yep.
and
Yep.
end of course. And
Absolutely.
everything's aligned. And so how do you function in a different situation?
Yeah, and there's a couple examples here in a couple states we're going to talk about where some of the instructional reviews are being asked to be reported. So, for example, a low-performing school that's been low for X amount of years, state board could require an instructional review of its instructional program, and then that must be reported back to the state board. It gives you a snapshot of what's happening in some of your school districts that may have turnaround or low performing schools has been identified as turnaround or identified in low performing schools. Most recently, I've been working with the school system for the past 2 years. We had a brand new superintendent. I was at one of the first meetings, and he asked the question, and they had state standards as well. He asked the question, "What's our instructional program?" And everyone in the room looked around and said, "We don't know." So his follow-up question is, what have we been teaching? And there are people that have been there 10, 15 years, 12 years. And someone said, "I've been here 15 years and we've never had a district-wide curriculum." Someone said, "I've been here 10 years, we never had one." He said, "So what's happening in the classroom?" And no one knew. So he spent the past 2 years developing an instructional infrastructure. I always use that story because that's one example of one district. But I have to tell you, I work across the country. This is a example that happens quite often for a school that is on the list. There is not an instructional infrastructure or expectations around instruction, and it varies across not only schools but across classrooms as well. This is one of the more common challenges I see, and it's always surprising to me. But each time I see the same thing.
That makes sense.
So from this standpoint,
This is-
oh yes, sir. Sorry, Board Member Baker.
Baker. And when we go out and begin working with other districts, we always pose the 4 questions from Rick to 4, which is, what is it that you want children to learn? Number 1. 2, how do you know if they learned it? 3, what do you do if they didn't learn it? And the bonus question, what do you do if they have learned it?
Yeah.
And when we finish posing those questions, we ask people in the room, how many of you think that your answer is going to be the same as everybody else in the room? And and in districts that are struggling, just as you said, no one knows.
Yep.
No one knows the answers to those 4 questions, and until those questions get answered, it's really hard to move forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Board Member Becker, you can't see us, but we're all nodding our heads in agreement with you. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, so what are states doing in this particular area? Nearly all states have policies related to intervention and preparing and monitoring school improvement plans. The most common policy with 41 states allow a state to conduct an instructional audit or an external evaluation of chronically low-performing schools. Another common intervention, more than half the states could require changes to the curriculum or instructions or changes to the school calendar or school day. Again, the backside of that is the reporting piece of that. More than 2/3 states have input in the development of a school improvement plan. 2/3 of states monitor the improvement plans as well. All of those allow space and opportunity to understand the instructional infrastructure and instructional strategies that are happening in the low-performing schools. And we see across the country many state boards taking advantage of that to try to understand this particular challenge. Going into the instructional audit, so one example in Alabama, the state superintendent has designated a team to visit these schools and conduct a study, consult with parents and students, analyze poor student achievement and make recommendations. Again, in Alabama, outside of Montgomery, you have the rural context. Much of this work, having worked with the state over the past several years, is taking place in the rural context, working with rural school districts and rural school systems as well. I want to pause and see if there's any questions on just what we've talked about from an instructional standpoint.
So have you seen success in Alabama doing this?
I think they have had some success in helping the school systems, A, identify some of these areas of need, and B, develop kind of strategies and plans to then put them in place. Now, like many places that have, or many schools have been identified low performing, or many systems, the implementation is where the challenge, where the rubber meets the road. What I feel that happens in Alabama and many other places is you're constantly hitting the start and restart button for a variety of reasons. Oftentimes, people are leaving, people are changing. Funding runs out to do the follow-up, to do the implementation type of support that's needed. So there's the identification of some of these as challenges, but there also need the help to then go do it as well. And I would say where there's been some success in Alabama, there's also been some funding challenges to then go do the work and support, once you've identified some of these areas of need. Something that's been really successful over the past 2 years, we've been supporting them in developing an Instructional Transformation Academy. And this academy was started through the state level where they are bringing in district leadership, regional offices, regional entities like county offices and other regional entities, as well as the schools that are going to be on the list. And each one of them have conducted kind of this needs sensing around their instructional strategy. They identify some strategies, and this Transformation Academy is actually designed to then support and develop what implementation and support looks like. So you have the regional entities for, I'll make this up, Hope School District, that is sitting hand in hand with Hope High School around developing an infrastructure to support training their teachers and developing and identifying what their instructional strategies are going to be. And that's been ongoing for 2 years. It was able to be sustained in part because where Alabama State superintendent, who was a big fan of this, left, the person that took his job actually came from the Superintendent's Association, who's been part of all of this work. So the first thing he wanted to do in his first month was continue the academy. In his mind, it was the first time where he's seen leaders at all levels, state, regional entity, district, and school together coalescing around owning what happens in the classroom around instruction. They don't have the data to show how successful this has been. They're entering year 2 now. But they now have some common language about what they're trying to not only accomplish. Now the regional entities have gone from a way of we need to sell our services to now we understand how to support you differently as your partner here in this particular region of the state. And the same with the districts.
So would you say every implementation success has funding that accompanies it?
To some degree, yes. Either new funding or a reimagining of existing funding. Okay. You can't develop the strategies and then not have the resources to then support it. And resources meaning people, time, as well as money. And I think that's where we kind of fail sometimes. Sometimes we make it just about people. Mm-hmm. Let's just add new people and without taking away some things, without recreating some time to allow this to happen. Right. Those things resources are really important, but I define the resources as people, money, and time. Great. To do those things.
That's good. Thank you.
Think about the Elevate program and when they shared with us, I think their teachers had 2 weeks together in the summer.
Right.
Getting professional development and training, not mentioning all the time throughout the year.
Right.
To continue to get together to refine their instructional program and reflect. So.
And then Avondale, is that the?
Yeah, but I think they're doing it in other places.
Other places too.
Yeah.
But that seems to be a common, and I think
absolutely.
Time. time together, paid time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
Any questions, reactions from anyone on the phone? Board Member Baker, Board Member Wellbone?
Nope.
Well, I'd just like to add that developing an instructional system is a very difficult task, especially if the culture and the systems in the school are broken. It's hard to develop success out of brokenness.
Yes.
But we know there are multiple systems, instructional systems out there that work. There's no one perfect system. There's no one system that's far superior to others. But there is a set of systems that do work.
Absolutely.
And one approach we can consider is to say, here's this collection of systems. You pick one, or maybe you tell us of another one that you picked, and then you plug that in, and you tell your teachers, this is our system. And if you don't like this system, then you should go somewhere else to teach. But everybody who's here is going to use this system.
Yep.
And once the system finds success with a successful system, then they can alter it, they can adapt it, they can change it. But the critical issue is getting everybody on a path to success. Otherwise, years, literally years, can be wasted as teachers go off to conferences, get trained in this, another group gets trained in something else, and everybody's running off in 5 different directions while instructional dysfunction continues in the classroom with kids who don't have years to spare.
Yes. Yes. Is there any way I can get that recording from Board Member Baker that I can use in other places? Well said, Board Member Baker. So true. Very true. And here are a couple examples I just added. Again, I typically don't add this much text, but I wanted you all to at least have that as a handout. In Connecticut, for example, they require the low-performing schools to implement a model curriculum, which could also include textbooks, materials, supplies that are approved by the State Department of Education. I could say the same thing about Louisiana right now as well. In Virginia, any school that's rated that is rated with a warning in English at the district level, but culture shift we define as